dealing with my slides problem. Okay, now will it let me present from here? Well, we'll just have it this way. That's fine.
Press F5, see if it works.
Or double click.
No.
You might have to sign in.
Okay, that's
No.
fine. You can still see it this way.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for dealing with my slides problem. This is my talk, The Times They Are A-Changin, about age and education level and how they relate to attitudes towards non-binary transgender people and attitudes towards using they as a singular pronoun. So just a couple of terms to go over. You all probably know all of this already, but just in case. In the purposes of this presentation, I'm talking about transgender people, specifically non-binary transgender people. So this would include like genderqueer, agender, etc. Then for cisgender people, that would be people who are not transgender. A queer sexual orientation is any sexual orientation that is not straight. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, etc. Straight, we know what that is. Using queer and LGBTQ+ as an umbrella term for the whole queer community. And then I'll be talking a little bit about aversive prejudice theory, which might be a little more unfamiliar. I actually come from a psychology background, so this is a psychological theory about how prejudice can be manifested by saying that your problem with one thing is actually a problem with another thing when your problem is really the first thing. So the classic version of this is aversive racism, where someone will say, oh, I don't have a problem with black people, I just hate when people abuse the welfare system. Well, really, they're racist, and they have a problem with black people. So I'm applying aversive prejudice theory to transgender people, and I'll get more into that later. I'm also clearly talking about using they as a singular pronoun, and I'm using two different contexts. The first is the general context, which is like, someone left their water bottle here. We don't know the gender of the person who we're referring to. And then the queer or transgender context is referring to a person who prefers to use they as their pronoun because they don't identify as male or female. So two different contexts. To work on this study, I performed a survey. I had 722 participants, which was super awesome to have a large group of people. There were a number of demographic questions that I asked about age and education level, race, sexual orientation, etc. There was an open response question to ask people their thoughts on the topic of the survey, and then the two main things that we'll be talking about are a scale about attitudes towards transgender individuals. So this would be questions like, it is acceptable to, transgender individuals should be accepted completely into our society, and then they rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how much they agree with the statement. There was a similar scale for attitudes towards using they as a singular pronoun, and I developed this scale for the purpose of my study. And there were two subscales as part of the larger scale, one for using they in the general context and one for using they in the queer context. So the general they subscale is items like, it is acceptable to use they to refer to one person if you are unsure of the person's gender. For example, someone left their phone in the lobby. And then the they queer transgender scale had questions like, if someone asked me to refer to them using gender-neutral pronouns such as they, them, and their, I would do my best to use those pronouns when talking about that person. And again, people just rated on a scale of 1 to 5 how much they agree with this statement. These little fishy signs, Chromex Alpha, how many of you are statistics people? No one? Yes? One? Yay! This basically just says how reliable the scale is. It's grades like just like ABC. So a 0.92 is like an A, it's really good. And then like 0.8 for this subscale is like a B, like this still totally acceptable. And then anything below that is more average and stuff like but all of my scales came out pretty well, and I was pleased with that. So I had a large range of participants everywhere from age 18 to 80, and the mean age was 35.6. And I had all different education levels, from people who had barely completed high school and all the way to a number of people who had their PhDs. For education level, this is the division. There was a little bit of a weight in the sample towards people with a high education level. So that's something I'll talk a little bit about later on. I also had a lot of representation for different genders and sexual orientations. 8% of my population was transgender in some way, shape, or form, and I would like to recognize that it's a little bit problematic to lump everyone who says they're non-binary or transgender male, transgender female, or anything other than cis male or female. I know that's problematic to lump it all into one category, but for the purpose of data analysis, it was necessary for this study. But I do want to put that disclaimer. And then only 67% of my sample was straight, so we had a good representation of people with a queer sexual orientation. So now that we know a little bit about the people who were in my survey, I want to give you some background about people's attitudes towards using they as a singular pronoun. I would like to call them the loud dingbats. They're the people who are very exclamatory on the internet about disliking using they as a singular pronoun, and these are some fun quotations to represent that. Jen Dahl from The Atlantic said, "The singular they is an ear-hurting, eye-burning, soul-ravaging, mind-numbing syntactic folly." This one is my favorite. Abigail Schreier from the Wall Street Journal opinion section said that for those with a religious conviction that sex is both biological and binary, God's purposeful creation, the singular they involves sacrilege no less than bowing to idols in the town square. Very extreme opinions. And then in the open response section of my survey, I had an anonymous participant who said, "I think it is wrong and society should try to stray from using the word they to refer to only one person." So there are some very strong opinions against using they as a singular pronoun. And because I knew of this background before I started my study, one of the most simple questions I wanted to ask was, how many people actually approve of using they as a singular pronoun? And despite all of these loud dingbats, I had a very encouraging response from my participants. The vast majority of people either strongly approved, or just didn't care about using they as a singular pronoun. And there were actually more people who approved of the singular they in the queer context than in the general context. So only about, what's 8 plus 3? 11 or 12% of people disapproved or strongly disapproved of they in the queer context, while there were 15-ish% of people who disapproved of they in the general context. And then again, the vast majority of people either approved, and the majority of people approved or didn't care. So that was very encouraging to see, despite those people on the internet who are like, it's folly and sacrilegious. So that's just our most simple statistical analysis. Getting more into the fancier analyses, I was looking at how age and education level predict attitudes towards they as a singular pronoun and attitudes towards transgender individuals. And I found that the younger someone is, that predicts the acceptance of transgender individuals and using they as a non-binary transgender pronoun, as you would expect. So it's good to find confirmation of my hypotheses. And higher education level actually also significantly predicted acceptance of trans people and acceptance of using they as a singular pronoun. And then these numbers here are just statistics to say, yes, what you found is probably right. P is less than 0.001 is basically the chance that you're wrong, the chance that your statistical analysis was wrong. So that's a very highly significant finding. Very excited. This is more math that says the same thing. If you want to know about the math, we can talk about it later. So I'm going to talk now about moderation analyses. The analysis that I just talked about is a simple prediction model, which is a regression analysis. Moderation analysis is a little more complicated, so I'm going to explain what that is before I go into what I found using a moderation analysis. So first, you're looking at how the thing 1 affects thing 2. So how you get thing 1 and thing 2 together, some crazy stuff happens. You guys know Dr. Seuss, thing 1 and thing 2. And then what we're really interested in is thing 3, the cat in the hat, how that plays into the relationship between thing 1 and thing 2. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. So looking at what we actually looked at, we wanted to see how age predicted attitudes towards transgender people. So we looked at that with the regression analysis, but then using education level as a moderator between that relationship. So explaining how education level affects age predicting attitudes towards transgender people. So we found that, well, age did have a significant main effect, which means that this relationship is significant. The higher someone's education level is, the weaker the relationship between age and attitudes towards trans people. So a higher education level softens that effect of age and on attitudes towards transgender individuals. So this is the math for that. When education level is low, the relationship between age and negative attitudes towards transgender people is super strong. When education level is medium, it's kind of average but still weaker. And then when education level is high, the relationship is still statistically significant. So age still does significantly predict attitudes towards trans people, but the relationship is much, much weaker. And that's what the B value is. You can see it goes down as the relationship, or the education level is higher. So the interesting thing was that education level did not moderate the relationship between age and attitudes towards using they as a singular pronoun. So we kind of expected that we would find the opposite thing, especially considering the findings of our regression analysis. But we dove into some explanations for this finding to see why, even though age did independently predict attitudes towards the singular they, education level did not moderate that relationship. Some of the explanations that we came up with were that attitudes towards using the singular they in a queer context could reflect a subtle prejudice against non-binary transgender people. So that's where that aversive prejudice theory comes in. So perhaps what's happening is that older, more well-educated people, throughout their education and experience in life have learned, oh, it's not okay to say that trans people are bad, so we need to be accepting of trans people. So on that explicit attitude scale where we're asking, it's acceptable to have trans people in society, these older, more educated people are saying, yes, this is good, trans people are fine. But then when it comes to a more subtle form of prejudice, which I would argue is looking at people's attitudes towards using they as a singular pronoun, the relationship did not come out in the way that we expected because of the fact that it's a more subtle form of measuring prejudice. So that's kind of what we're thinking was going on there. We also considered that perhaps education is not enough to counter all of the ingrained implicit prejudice developed from years and years and years of exposure to social and cultural negativity towards gender and sexual minorities. So this is another potential explanation for why education did not influence the relationship between age and acceptance of using the singular they for a gender non-binary person. And in this case, what we propose is that this negativity could be rationalized as being directed at improper grammar, a prescriptive grammar mentality, rather than the person's sexual identity, when in reality the problem is that they dislike trans people. Also, obviously this could be just a lack of knowing about using they as a singular pronoun for non-binary people, or it could be an issue of frequency with which older, more well-educated people have encountered transgender non-binary individuals who use they as their pronoun. An example of someone who said something that kind of backs that up is that an anonymous participant in the open response section said, it's been quite difficult to switch to they when people request that I use that pronoun to refer to them. I found it much easier this summer, for instance, when I met a totally new person who wanted the pronoun they. That wasn't so difficult, but I have had to switch from she to they for someone I've known for more than 10 years, and that has been a challenge for me. so that, you know, familiarity, the frequency issue could play into why we didn't find that significant relationship. So in sum, the vast majority of participants either approve of using the singular they or neither agree nor disagree with it. They don't really have a preference one way or another. Education level does have a significant impact on the relationship between age and attitudes towards transgender people, but does not have a significant impact on the relationship between age and attitudes towards using the singular they. Higher age does predict negative attitudes towards transgender people, but a higher education level softens this effect. Measuring attitudes towards the queer they, we think, could provide insight into aversive prejudice against transgender individuals. So this is really important because as we look at theories of prejudice, there's not a lot out there about prejudice against transgender individuals, and this is really, really important as people with diverse gender identities become more and more visible in society. So this, we hope, could influence our understanding of how people feel about gender non-binary individuals and transgender people as a whole. We could use this research to understand what affects people's attitudes towards the singular they and attitudes towards trans people, and potentially, you know, use that understanding to help people become more accepting of using the singular they and more accepting of gender non-binary individuals. So as I continue to study this, I really, really hope that this has a positive influence on the trans community and on academic research about transgender individuals. So thank you.
Thank you.
I would also, other than just thanking you for coming, would like to thank my thesis committee, especially Dr. Shannon Bischoff, who's had a significant impact on my ability to study this, and Yinda Jazz, who some of you probably know, who helped me get a lot of my queer participants, and Mr. Ash Shukla, who helped me with a lot of the data analysis. So yeah, does anyone have questions, comments, or concerns? Yes?
How independent are age and education?
What exactly do you mean by that?
I mean, like an 18-year-old by definition doesn't have a PhD.
Right, yeah, so there's definitely a significant relationship between age and education level, but I did have a very diverse population as far as, you know, people with different education levels, people with different ages. You know, so I had a number of participants who were older and didn't have a higher education level, so I'm hoping that that diversity of participants can kind of balance out the strong correlation between age and education
Did
level.
you explore the independent statistically?
Yes, I did. So that goes back to that math slide that I had here. So this is looking at age and education as independent predictors of attitudes towards transgender people, attitudes towards they in the general context, and attitudes towards they in the queer context. And both of them significantly predicted what we would expect to find. So they are very, very related, but we were still able, the effects were different enough looking at this math that we could still analyze them as individual variables. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about using Amazon Mechanical Turk, because I'm thinking of using that. I don't know, what was your experience with it?
Yeah.
Was it good?
Yeah, my experience with Mechanical Turk is amazing. I forgot to talk about where I got my participants from. So some were from Mechanical Turk, and then some were from listserv. Some of you may have taken my survey through like LinguistList and a couple of other linguistics listservs. But specifically for Mechanical Turk, it's very easy to use. You just make your survey on any online program. You go onto Mechanical Turk. You put in like a little description of the survey and then a link to it. And then at the end of the survey, you can set up a little bit of coding, very simple coding that you can find pre-done online to generate a random code for each individual participant. So then they get an anonymous code that they put into Mechanical Turk to show that they did the survey. And then you just check the codes between what someone put in and the code that your program generated to make sure that they're matching. Honestly, I've never had them not match, so sometimes I don't even check it. I pay $1 per survey, which is a pretty high rate for a 20 to 30 minute survey. There's lots of surveys on Mechanical Turk that only paid like 20, 25 cents USD per 20, 30 minute survey. So if you pay $1 or more, you get participants very quickly. I think that I think 223 of my participants were from Mechanical Turk, and I collected them in less than a week. Yeah, so I've had very, very positive experiences with Mechanical Turk. And in addition to that, if you're concerned about like the generalizability of that data, there's a lot of research comparing Mechanical Turk populations to other populations. So you can look into some of that research, or I can send you some to kind of demonstrate that it is an effective way of generalizing participants. Yes.
I was just following on from that. Were you looking for any specific demographics? Was this open to anyone in the world, basically?
Yeah, it was open to anyone in the world. I would love to analyze the difference between attitudes of English first language speakers and English second language speakers, but I didn't get a ton of L2 English speakers, so I'm not able to do that at this time, but I am replicating this survey this summer. So we'll see how that pans out.
I'm wondering, if you were looking for quite a specific demographic, say just non-binary people, would Amazon Mechanical Turk be a good method, do you think?
No. Mechanical Turk mostly there is a leaning towards straight, mid-level, educated, cisgender people on Mechanical Turk. The socioeconomic status of people on Mechanical Turk doesn't tend to be particularly high because people are basically doing work for slave wages, which is pretty messed up, and I have ethical sadness about that. But to find queer participants, I used the linguistics listserv. You can talk to Yinda and see if they can help you find more participants.
Yeah, we've already been.
Queer participants, yeah. And then in addition to that, I'm planning on using different Facebook groups for queer people to promote my survey this summer. So I'm hoping to get more and more queer participants.
Thank you, Alice. Is it possible to take the rest of the questions in the coffee break so that we
Yeah.
can
Yeah,
keep
that's fine.
schedule?
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you.